next, let's talk about some of the physical geography of, we're going to contrast the physical geography of Europe and the climate of Europe with that of the Russian realm. And so one thing that we mentioned in the European realm is that at least the western part of Europe is dominated by sea climates. Those are climates that are mild and they have the influence from the ocean, especially the warm currents of the North Atlantic Drift. And those help to moderate and make the climate less cold. As we get into the interior, we get into what are called D climates. So let's kind of review. We got sea climates. They're not so cold. They're wet, but mild. So much of Western Europe, but not Russia. Okay, talked about these recently. Not so cold. They have a winter time, but it's not an extreme winter time. Now, as we get into the Russian realm, particularly Russia, we get into D climates. And Central Asia, by the way, you're getting into closer to the Middle East, and it's dry, desert and grassland. But for Russia itself, it is dominated by D or cold winter climates, and in some parts, even polar climates, things that you would associate with the North or South Pole because of the high latitude. So these are D climates. You have them primarily in a little bit of the United States, Canada, and then also in Russia. One thing that we talked about in the introduction when we talked about weather and climate is the continental effect. So if you compare San Francisco with Wichita, Kansas, San Francisco doesn't get very cold in the wintertime and not very hot in the summertime. This is what we mean by a mild climate. Whereas Wichita, Kansas is a place of extremes. It can be very warm in the summer, but very cold in the wintertime. It can be freezing. And the difference between the two is San Francisco is influenced by the ocean, it's by the water, where Wichita is in the middle of the land, and that's called the continental effect. And continental climates are also known as the D climates. These are what we call severe climates, which can be very cold in the wintertime. The vegetation environments in these places is often cold and wet forests, particularly what we call coniferous forests, like in high mountains or in places like Russia that are called the taiga, or the boreal forests in Canada, these massive forests that are adapted to these cold winter conditions. Russia also has a little bit of E climates. These are really polar climates, the most extremely cold climates on Earth, like in Antarctica or Greenland. So those are part of Russia includes those climates as well, similar to Canada. So E climates are always cold. They don't really have much of a summer season. In fact, that's one reason that E climates tend to be treeless, because it's so cold the trees can't even grow. This is something called tundra, a type of environment that is treeless because of the cold conditions. These are some climate graphs, and these are graphs that show you the trends in temperature and rainfall throughout the year, but we're going to focus on temperature. This is the temperature pattern for a C climate, and this is one for a D climate. And while they both get fairly warm in the summertime, one maybe not quite as much, the big difference is that D climates or continental climates get extremely cold in the wintertime, whereas this one stays pretty mild year-round. So that big difference, that continental effect is about how the extremes, how warm, specifically how cold it gets in the wintertime. And then if we go beyond there to the E climates are a little bit like D climates, but they don't even really get warm enough in the summertime. And that's one reason why E climates have these they can have this what's called tundra, or a treeless environment. So this is showing a couple of different types of a few different types of environments. This big green thing here, this is what's called the coniferous forest, these big cold forests that are typical of Siberia. And these are what's called tundra. The places that are so cold, trees don't even grow there. So just to recap, and this is important stuff here, Russia is dominated by a continental climate. Continental climates are for places that are far from the ocean and have very cold winters. And even this part that's over kind of near the ocean, it's still the same reason, because the winds are blowing in the opposite direction. So because winds are blowing offshore, it doesn't really help to be by this ocean. So continental climates far from the oceans, they have extremely cold winters. You have two different types of environment here. You have the taiga. The taiga is the largest forest zone on Earth. It covers much of Russia, and it's coniferous forests, and they are trees that are designed that they can survive the cold winters, but in summer it's warm enough for them to grow. Where you have even more of an extreme environment, you have tundra. Tundra is associated with the very coldest climates. They are treeless because they're not warm enough in the winter for trees to grow. And then lastly, one thing that is associated, especially with tundra, but even throughout these cold climates, is something called permafrost, where you have frozen soil, that the water in the soil is actually frozen either for all of the year or for a part of the year. So let me just label this to kind of show you. At the extremes, you have tundra. These are the treeless environments. Below that, you have the taiga. These are that big, massive forest. As you get into Central Asia, it gets drier. You get into what's called the Russian steppe. These are grassland zones. And then you get into deserts as you get in towards the Middle East. The taiga is the world's largest continuous forest vegetation region or biome. We discussed the boreal forest in Canada, which is a smaller version of this, but in Russia it's even bigger. It's called the taiga. This is an image showing tundra. Again, tundra is so cold that it's treeless. Now, especially in the treeless tundra, but extending into the coniferous forest, you also can have permafrost. Permafrost is where the water in the ground is frozen. And it's not only just interesting in that regard, but it also provides challenges for human settlement. So, for example, where you have these pipelines, you'll notice that they're above the ground, because if you warm the ground, it can become unstable. And so you have to build things that are above the permafrost, so that otherwise the ground can become a wet mess, a wet, muddy mess, and become unstable. So permafrost has its own unique challenges in these cold environments.